All right, ladies and gentlemen, here we are to continue with our talk about Reconstruction. And the learning targets for this part of the video is to be able to explain the 14th and 15th Amendments, the Ku Klux Klan, what they were and what they tried to do, and to be able to explain the importance of the Supreme Court case Plessy versus Ferguson. All right, let's get started. When we last left in the previous video, we were talking about black codes, and we were talking about Congress wanting to take over Reconstruction because they didn't like the way the new president was handling Reconstruction. And so that's where we're going to start today with moving forward here. First off, we talked about Abraham Lincoln being assassinated in April of 1865. When he is killed, the vice president, Andrew Johnson, becomes president. You can see Andrew Johnson pictured here on the screen. And Andrew Johnson's Reconstruction plan was like Lincoln's, but the major difference with Johnson's plan was that wealthy Southerners and Confederates had to ask Johnson for a pardon. Okay. Now, what that means is that a Southerner or a Confederate, a wealthy Southerner or a Confederate, in order to come back into the Union and take part in the government, what the Southerner had to do is they had to write President Johnson a letter and say, "Dear Mr. President, will you please allow me to hold office in the state of Georgia or in the state of Mississippi? Will you please pardon me?" And a lot of congressmen thought, well, that's great. The president will obviously say no. Okay. Unfortunately, the congressman found out that President Johnson was not saying no. He was saying to almost everybody that asked him, yes, you can be pardoned, and yes, you can run your state government if you would like. And this makes people angry because a lot of the same people who decided to start the Civil War were the same people that were now going back and being in charge of their states. And so for a lot of Northerners, it seemed to them like the Civil War and those soldiers who died during it, that they died for no reason. And so a lot of congressmen were angry with President Johnson, and they wanted to take over Reconstruction. So this creates a battle between President Johnson versus Congress. Okay, and that battle we're going to talk about here over the next couple of minutes. Congress and the president argue about who has more power in this process of Reconstruction. Congress, to address the black codes that have been going on in the South, they decide to pass new laws to end these black codes. But President Johnson says no. And he says no because he doesn't believe that it's Congress's job to make these laws for the states. And Congress is mad that President Johnson said no. So they tried to pass these laws again. This time, again, President Johnson says no. However, there are enough votes in Congress for Congress to override the president and say yes. And so Congress overrides the president and creates the Civil Rights Act of 1866. Now that Civil Rights Act eventually leads to the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. Now the 14th Amendment is still very important today. It's an amendment that guarantees our freedom, and it's an amendment that you should know about. So let's talk about what this amendment involves. The 14th Amendment says that all people born in the United States are citizens. That meant for the first time in American history, African Americans were going to be recognized in the Constitution as citizens. Now, things weren't perfect yet because you'll see here, Native Americans were not considered citizens yet. Eventually they will be. But for our purposes and what we're talking about today, African Americans with the 14th Amendment are now considered citizens of the United States. And because they're citizens, the 14th Amendment also says that citizens receive equal protection of the law. That means they get the same protection. African Americans, whites, whoever gets equal protection of the law as long as they are citizens. Okay? The other important piece to the 14th Amendment is that no citizen could be deprived of life, liberty, or property without the process of law. So that means that a person, white or black, could not have their life taken away, their liberty taken away, or their property taken away without some legal reason behind it and the process of the law to make that happen. Okay? Those things are very important about the 14th Amendment. And those things are some of the things that are currently being argued about in our current election as well, both statewide and nationally. Okay? So, the 14th Amendment is an amendment that allows African Americans, it actually guarantees African Americans as citizens, and it guarantees protection under the law. It addresses the black codes that had been created in the South. But that doesn't stop the fight between the president and Congress. Congress decides to take over Reconstruction, and they put troops in the South to enforce the 14th Amendment. So if those states wanted to continue to have these black codes, they would have to do so under the watchful eye of the United States Army. President Johnson doesn't like this. And he also doesn't like the fact that Congress is now making laws that limit his power. And one of the laws that they pass is that the president was not be allowed to fire a cabinet member. And he doesn't like that. He thinks that law is wrong. He thinks it's unconstitutional. And he flat out breaks it. He fires a member of his cabinet just to show Congress that he could do it. Well, Congress doesn't like this. So Congress impeaches President Johnson. Congress has the power to impeach a president if he breaks a law. And the president broke a law, and for that reason, Congress drew up impeachment papers. Now, the impeachment process is unique because you can be impeached and still hold on to your presidency. The first part of the process is the House of Representatives draws up impeachment papers or charges. And that's what happens with President Johnson. He's charged with a crime. And then the second part of the process is a trial that takes place in the Senate. And the senators turn into the jury for the president. And then there's a final vote that decides whether the president gets to keep his job or he has to be removed. Well, President Johnson, when the vote comes in the Senate, keeps his presidency by 1 or 2 votes. Very, very slim margin, he keeps his presidency. And so he is impeached, but he also gets to remain the president. Now, what this does, though, it reduces the president's power. It basically takes away any power that he might have had. And because of that, he chooses not to run for re-election anymore. He decides not to run for a second term. So President Johnson, in this fight, president versus Congress, the president loses, okay, and Congress wins, okay. So moving forward, that means part of the Congress plan after impeaching the president was to create the 15th Amendment. And the 15th Amendment allows African American men to vote. Sorry, ladies, but you're not allowed to vote yet, white or black. But the 15th Amendment does allow African American men to vote. Now, with the help of these African American voters, Ulysses S. Grant becomes the next president of the United States. That's right, the same guy that we talked about in the Civil War who ended up getting the surrender of Robert E. Lee. He becomes the president of the United States. And African Americans in the South, with protection from the military, as well as these new amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, known as the Freedom Amendments, African Americans in the South start to begin to experience freedom. They begin to go out to the polls and vote. They begin to be elected, and they start to create laws, things that would have been unimaginable 10 years before. and African Americans get this gift of freedom, and they start to become citizens using those particular freedoms. However, not everybody likes this. Matter of fact, many of the Southerners do not like this, and a group of Southerners creates a terrorist group known as the Ku Klux Klan. The Ku Klux Klan was an American terrorist group. Its design was to terrorize African Americans away from voting. And it was created by a group of white Southerners in Tennessee in 1866. It was a secret society that was opposed to the civil rights, especially voting rights. That's what the word suffrage down here means, voting rights, particularly voting rights for African Americans. And they would do whatever they could to prevent or scare African Americans away from voting. They used violence and terror. I said it was a secret society. That's why they wore hoods. And to make things even worse is that generally during this time period in the South, members of the Ku Klux Klan were people that were important in the government. They were like the local policemen. They were the sheriff. They were the mayor. They were the council members of those particular cities and those governments. And they were the ones that were actually part of this secret society. And although there were local governments and people that tried to stop this violence, it was difficult because a lot of the people in charge were part of this. So the United States Congress sends troops and passes laws to make sure that the Ku Klux Klan can be weakened. Matter of fact, one of the laws they passed made it a federal crime to interfere with elections or deny citizens their equal protection under the law. And so the troops are there, and while the troops are there, they are preventing the Ku Klux Klan from being too terrorizing to African Americans. Okay? But that's going to change when the troops are asked to leave. And that's what we come to here is the end of Reconstruction. And one of the things that causes those troops to leave the South is the fact that the economy goes into the tank. It goes down. The economy goes down, and it's because of a panic, an economic panic in 1873 that caused many people to think that, you know what, we're spending all this money to keep troops in the South. We should be spending that money on improving our economy. And so a lot of Northerners thought that it was a waste of money to keep troops in the South. Along with this, because the economy was going down, Republicans lost support from voters. And so in the election of 1876, the voting was so close between the presidential candidates that it wasn't decided right away who won. And the two candidates were Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel J. Tilden. Eventually, a compromise is reached, and it becomes known as the Compromise of 1877. Under this compromise, the Republican candidate, the guy you see here, Rutherford B. Hayes, would be the new president. But in return for being named president, the Democrats asked that the troops be removed from the South. And so Rutherford B. Hayes keeps that promise, and he removes the troops from the South. Okay? When this happens, Reconstruction officially ends. And the southern states start to go back to making laws against African Americans. With the troops gone, southern governments pass laws that limit the rights of African Americans, except now they're called Jim Crow laws, or another term for them is segregation. And segregation is the forced separation of the races, which meant that there was a separate water fountain for whites and a separate water fountain for blacks. And you couldn't go to the other one. If you were white, you had to go to the white water fountain. If you're black, you had to go to the black water fountain. Okay? These segregation laws, or Jim Crow laws, are challenged in the Supreme Court in a court case known as Plessy versus Ferguson. Homer Plessy was a man, an African-American man, who was traveling on a train. And he had bought a ticket for a sleeper car, but but the train company would not allow him to sleep in that sleeper car because he was black. He was forced to sit in the back in the African American section of the train because of these segregation laws. So the case goes all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court case, known as Plessy versus Ferguson, made segregation legal. The Supreme Court in the 1870s, I can't remember the exact date, the Supreme Court with this case makes the decision that Homer Plessy, because he was African American, could legally be separated from whites. And so that meant that segregation was legal as long as the facilities were equal. And so if there was a white water fountain, there had to be a black water fountain. And by equal, they didn't mean that they had to be equally as good, just that there had to be another one. There had to be one for whites and one for blacks. And so this idea of separate but equal becomes the legal reasoning upheld by the Supreme Court for segregation. Okay? And because of that, African Americans lose all of that freedom that they had gained in that short time during Reconstruction. So if you think about this, in about 1877, when Rutherford B. Hayes is elected, African Americans begin to lose their freedom. They don't get their freedom again, and they're still fighting for their freedom in 1963, when Martin Luther King gives his I Have a Dream speech. If you do the math on this, I guess if I do the math on this, that's 86 years after the Civil War before African Americans start to even taste the same freedom that they had right after the Civil War. Okay? So for the rest of the history class over the course of this year, we're going to be talking about the fact that Southern African Americans do not have equal rights. They have this thing called segregation down there. And if they do move north, African Americans, if they do choose to move north, they still are facing this discrimination that they're not equal when they come to the north, because many whites share that discrimination. So going back to the beginning of this, here's this picture again. This picture represents slavery before Civil War, and then after the Civil War, African Americans get some freedom during this Reconstruction time. But very quickly after those 12 years, that freedom is taken away. And for the next 86 years or so, even more than that, African Americans are not given the same freedoms that they had for just a short time after the Civil War. Okay, so just to recap, your learning targets for this chapter was that I can explain important events, concepts from the Reconstruction period. You should be able to tell me the difference between the 10% plan and the Wade-Davis bill. You should be able to tell me what black codes are. You should be able to define the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. They're also called the Freedom Amendments. You should be able to tell me what the Ku Klux Klan tried to do. And you should be able to tell me why the court case Plessy versus Ferguson is important. Okay, so all of those things you should be able to explain. If you can't do that, please go back and watch parts of this video again. Ask me questions in class. Look through your notes again, read through those notes. But you're responsible for being able to do those things that you see on the screen here. Okay. Thank you very much, and we'll look forward to seeing you in class.